April 16th, 1947, Texas City, Texas. At 9:12 a.m. the sky turned white. A roar like thunder ripped through the harbour as the Grand Camp exploded, a 7,000-ton cargo ship packed with ammonium nitrate. The blast levelled nearly 1,000 buildings in seconds. Windows shattered 40 miles away. Steel twisted like paper. Men vanished. Trucks melted where they stood. The sea caught fume. When the dust began to fall, half the city was gone, and the silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. So how could something like this happen? Before the explosion, Texas City was a picture of post-war promise. A small port town of 15,000 people, resting on the Gulf Coast between Galveston and Houston, proud, industrious, and humming with new life. The war was over, but its machinery still defined the skyline: oil refineries, grain elevators, and a bustling dock that never slept. Ships came and went with the precision of a heartbeat. Men in denim and sweat-stained caps loaded sulphur, oil and fertilizer bound for Europe's recovery. Wives hung laundry on lines that flapped in the salty breeze. Children played marbles in the shade of grain silos that rose like cathedrals. Texas City was built on faith. Faith in work, in progress, and in the chemistry that fueled both. Few gave a second thought to what filled those steel drums or burlap sacks stacked on the ships. It was just another day's cargo. The Grand Camp had docked 2 days earlier, carrying nearly 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, the same substance that had helped Europe's fields bloom after years of war. It was labelled fertilizer grade, harmless in appearance, pale yellow crystals packed in paper sacks. The dock workers didn't know that when heated and confined, those same crystals could become an explosive more powerful than TNT. That Wednesday morning dawned calm. A light south wind carried the smell of salt and oil. Dock foremen checked manifests, longshoremen joked over cigarettes, and the local volunteer firefighters prepared for another uneventful shift. But down in the hold of the Grand Camp something had begun to smoulder, a faint, acrid smoke rising between the sacks. The crew thought it was a small fire, nothing more. They sealed the hatch, hoping to starve it of air. What they didn't know was that the fire was feeding on oxygen trapped deep in the cargo, growing hotter, stronger, unstoppable. In a town built on the faith of progress, the seeds of catastrophe were already burning unseen beneath the decks. The people. They were the beating heart of a post-war town, ordinary men and women whose lives revolved around work, faith, and the steady rhythm of the Gulf. In 1947, Texas City was no place of grandeur. It was a working man's town built on grit, heat, and the promise that effort could build a future. The smell of oil clung to everything: clothes, porches, the salt wind rolling in from the bay. To outsiders it might have seemed harsh, but to those who lived there, it smelled like livelihood. Ships lined the docks like monuments to progress. Their horns marked the passing of each day, morning, noon, and dusk, while refineries glowed like constellations after dark. The war had ended just 2 years earlier, and though the guns were silent, the engines of industry roared louder than ever. America was rebuilding the world, and Texas City was part of that grand endeavour. Each dawn brought a tide of men heading toward the port gates, lunch pails swinging, conversation clipped and familiar. They spoke of baseball scores, of the cost of gas, of whose boy had made sergeant and who was coming home. Beneath those ordinary exchanges lived a quiet pride. These were men who had survived the Depression, endured a world war, and now, finally, believed in peace. Among them was Fred Dowdy, 35, a stevedore with a stoic face and a dry wit. Fred had worked the docks since before Pearl Harbor, lifting, hauling, and securing cargoes from ships that bore names and flags from half the globe. During the war, he had served on merchant vessels, ferrying supplies through submarine-infested waters. More than once he had seen ships disappear in sudden columns of smoke. He returned home in 1946, grateful for ordinary danger, the kind that came from weathered ropes and swinging cargo, not from shells and torpedoes. He married young, raised 3 children, and rented a small house not far from the refinery gates. That Wednesday morning, April 16th, began like any other. He left early, whistling to himself, stepping over puddles from the night's rain. The streets were quiet except for the low rumble of trucks heading toward the port. His wife Clara waved from the porch, apron still on, coffee steaming in her hand. They'd been saving for a refrigerator, something brand new and electric. Fred promised he'd stop by the hardware store on his way home to see if one had come in. He couldn't know that by mid-morning there would be no hardware store, no porch, no home to return to. Across the harbour, aboard the French freighter Grand Camp, another man went about his routine with equal devotion. Captain Charles de Guillebon had weathered every hardship a seaman could face. He had ferried troops and supplies across wartime Atlantic waters, dodging mines and Luftwaffe bombers. His ship had taken fire once, near the coast of Algiers, but she had held fast. To him, the Grand Camp was not just a vessel, it was a promise that France could stand again. Its cargo, 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, was meant for Europe's soil, a symbol of renewal. Every sack loaded in Texas City carried the hope that spring would return to lands long scarred by war. He was a disciplined man, courteous but firm. His crew respected him because he demanded it, but also because he worked alongside them. They had spent 2 days loading cargo under a mild Texas sun. By the morning of the 16th, they were almost ready to cast off. Their destination, Brest, France. De Guillebon wrote a letter to his wife that morning, sealing it before breakfast. He told her the sea was calm, that the Americans were kind, and that he hoped to be home before the summer harvest. He signed it with a simple line, "Until then, my heart remains at sea." In the town below, the heartbeat of Texas City pulsed with a rhythm all its own. Refinery whistles dictated time more than any clock. The shift change at Monsanto sent waves of men on bicycles down the same long road that led to the docks. The bakery opened its doors at 6 sharp, filling the streets with the smell of fresh bread that mingled with the tang of gasoline and brine. Housewives bought groceries on credit, gossiping at the counter about the new houses going up north of town. At the volunteer fire station, Captain Paul Smith was reviewing reports from the week. The department was small but proud. 28 volunteers, a few second-hand engines, and a commitment that went beyond any paycheck. Paul had been born in Texas City, raised on the very streets he now patrolled. He believed deeply in his duty. His wife called it stubbornness. He called it belonging. On good days, they handled brush fires or oil spill flare-ups at the docks. On bad ones, they fought chemical blazes that roared like dragons in the night. Every man knew the risks, but no one dwelled on them. In those years, courage was a quiet thing, an expectation, not a declaration. Down by the port, the men of the morning shift gathered for coffee before the whistle. They stood in groups, leaning against wooden crates, boots dusted with salt and soot. Their laughter carried over the gulls. Someone teased a young deckhand about getting married too soon. Another bragged about his new pickup, the first he'd ever owned. The dockhands were family. In a town this size, everyone was. Children walked to school in pressed shirts and braids, waving to fathers who called back from the piers. Teachers opened classroom windows to let in the cool Gulf air. No one noticed the faint orange haze rising from the Grand Camp's midship vent, a slow, lazy plume that looked no different from morning fog. If you had stood on the bluff that morning, you would have seen a city in motion, refineries humming, cargo cranes swinging, trains shunting tank cars down the line. The bay glimmered like hammered glass. To all appearances, it was another ordinary Wednesday in a place built on extraordinary effort. But beneath that stillness, stories converged. Stories of men who had learned to trust the grind of machinery, who believed that progress was invincible. Stories of women who built homes from little more than faith and habit. Stories of sailors who thought danger lived only in wartime seas. That convergence of human hope, of ignorance, of routine, was the quiet prelude to catastrophe. For the workers at the refineries, life revolved around noise. The rhythmic pounding of pumps, the high whine of turbines, the hiss of steam. These sounds became the backdrop to every conversation, the music of prosperity. Men learned to read danger through vibration rather than volume. A new hiss, a different rhythm could mean a leak or a fire. But after years on the job, few paid attention to such subtleties. The city's soundtrack had grown familiar, and familiarity breeds blindness. At the Pan American refinery, technicians checked pressure gauges with one eye on the clock. At the Monsanto plant, engineers in white shirts reviewed safety protocols over coffee, their talk drifting between refinery upgrades and baseball. They were confident men, part of a generation that believed technology could conquer any problem. But Texas City was more than machinery. It was a community woven together by shared routine and mutual trust. Every Saturday, families gathered for barbecues under live oaks. Every Sunday, the churches filled to capacity. Baptist, Methodist, and Catholic bells ringing in sequence across town. The port might have been their livelihood, but faith was their foundation. It was a modest faith, quiet and practical. When disasters struck elsewhere, a refinery fire in Port Arthur, an explosion in Galveston, the people of Texas City sent help. They believed themselves prepared, not invulnerable but capable. Theirs was a world built on self-reliance. They could not imagine that a ship in their own harbour could undo everything in a single breath. Among the dock workers, there was also Jose Ramirez, a Mexican-American father of 4 who had moved north for steady work after the war. He laboured in the loading crews, known for his endurance and for singing as he worked, soft Spanish ballads that echoed between the cranes. He dreamed of saving enough money to buy a small house in Galveston where his children could attend better schools. The war had changed him. He had worked on the construction crews for the Navy, building ports overseas. Danger didn't scare him. What frightened him most was not having work. When smoke first appeared from the Grand Camp that morning, Jose laughed and said, "Looks like the French are cooking breakfast." No one thought otherwise. Fires were common, contained, and often ignored. In the nearby office of the Texas City Sun, a young reporter named John Parker sat at his desk typing notes about a new refinery expansion deal. He was 24 and ambitious, still learning to balance facts and deadlines. When he saw the column of smoke from his window, he grabbed his camera, thinking it might make a small local story for tomorrow's front page. He walked down to the docks, camera slung over his shoulder, ready to capture a routine photo of another minor port incident. He didn't know that he was walking toward one of the last photographs he would ever take. At the heart of the town's identity was pride. Pride in work, in survival, in the belief that industry was a kind of patriotism. These were not reckless people. They were practical, hard-working, and convinced that their labour was noble. Many had fought in Europe or the Pacific. They had seen destruction and vowed to replace it with progress. And progress, by 1947, was tangible. Steady pay, paved roads, electric appliances, the promise of a better life for their children. No one questioned what it took to achieve it. The dock workers trusted the foreman. The foreman trusted the cargo manifests. The city trusted the refineries that provided its lifeblood. Every man did his part, never considering how fragile the chain truly was. Each generation that built America carried that same conviction that labour, discipline, and faith could hold the world together. And yet, as history would prove, sometimes all it takes to unravel it is a single spark in the wrong place at the wrong time. On April 16, 1947, that spark had already been struck. The men of Texas City went about their morning unaware that their lives were being measured now, not in hours, but in minutes. The warning signs. Morning light glinted off the cranes and railcars, and the port carried on as always. Yet beneath that calm, the Grand Camp was beginning to change. At about 8 a.m, a faint wisp of smoke drifted from the No. 2 hold, so thin it looked like dust. A deckhand noticed it first, called to another, and together they lifted the hatch. The smell was sharp, chemical, and sweet, like burnt sugar mixed with fertilizer. Between the stacked paper sacks, thin threads of smoke curled upward. The ship's crew had seen small fires before, cargo caught heat, ropes smouldered, paint bubbled, timid, hazards of the trade. But ammonium nitrate was different, though few on board understood how. To them it was a harmless fertilizer, a peacetime commodity. The captain ordered water lines uncoiled, but the crew hesitated. Seawater could ruin the cargo and delay their departure. Instead, he gave a familiar command: do steam the hold. It was a decision born of experience and faith in procedure. Steam, when used on ships, could suffocate a fire. But this was no ordinary blaze. When the scalding vapour met the already heated crystals below, the chemical began to break down faster. Pressure built quietly in the dark. By 8:15, the smoke had deepened in colour, turning from grey to a strange orange hue. Dockworkers paused to watch. Some said it looked beautiful, and a drifting ribbon rising over the masts against the blue of the sky. Others began to taste bitterness on their tongues. A few men joked about the French barbecue. Others crossed themselves. In a port that lived on risk, danger had to look spectacular before anyone worried. The foreman on duty telephoned the harbour office. A minor fire aboard a vessel. Routine, no urgency. The city's volunteer fire brigade was dispatched more from caution than alarm. As the firemen rolled down the waterfront, children walking to school stopped to stare. They pointed at the plume and laughed. Housewives hung their laundry and paused, shading their eyes toward the docks. The day still seemed harmless, the kind of spectacle that would fill the local paper's middle pages. But on deck, things were worsening. The hatches had been sealed, trapping the reaction inside. The steel plates grew hot enough to burn the soles of boots. A crewman shouted that the pressure gauge in the forward compartment was climbing. The captain, unwilling to risk panic, ordered the cargo ventilated through the vents. When the smoke poured out thicker than ever, men on the pier began backing away. One of them, a longshoreman named Joe Chambers, remembered later, "It wasn't smoke like any other fire I'd seen. It was heavy, like it had weight." At 8:30, the orange cloud rose higher, drifting across the harbour. The siren of the volunteer fire department wailed through town, a long, familiar cry that usually ended in relief. Firemen in leather coats and brass helmets climbed aboard the burning ship, dragging hoses behind them. Among them was Captain Paul Smith. He barked orders, calm as ever, directing his men to the port side. They aimed streams of water at the deck, unaware that the heart of the fire was sealed beneath their feet. Crowds gathered along the pier, refinery workers, clerks, dock hands on break. Some climbed railings for a better view. A few men from the Pan American plant brought cameras. The orange smoke, illuminated by sunlight, shimmered like copper dust. It drew people in rather than warning them away. Inside the hold, the temperature was now past 850 degrees Fahrenheit. The paper sack split open. The ammonium nitrate began to melt into a dense liquid that released oxygen as it decomposed. Feeding the fire, it was supposed to starve. The Grand Camp's captain ordered all hands off the ship except those fighting the blaze. But by then the deck was too hot to touch, and the hissing of steam turned to a hollow roar. The ship trembled, almost breathing. At the harbour office, a clerk telephoned the refinery control room. He warned that the French ship might explode. The reply came back flat. "Those bags aren't dynamite." They can't blow. That confidence was shared by nearly everyone who had ever handled the stuff. By 8:45, the crowd on shore was several hundred strong. A photographer from the Texas City Sun lifted his Graflex camera and captured the plume. The picture would later appear in newspapers around the world, smoke billowing peacefully from a ship moments before annihilation. A Coast Guard official on the scene tried to clear the pier. He shouted for people to move back, but the wind carried his words away. Children perched on fence rails. Workers lingered, hands on hips. Curiosity, more than fear, held them there. At 9 a.m., the fire intensified. Witnesses described hearing a deep humming sound as though the ship was straining against itself. The water at its sides began to boil. The hull expanded outward in subtle pulses. Firefighters thought it was the heat. In truth, it was pressure. One sailor threw down his hose and leapt to the dock, screaming in French. Others followed. Captain de Guillabon stayed aboard, shouting orders. His last words, according to a surviving crewman, were, "Hold fast, we must not panic." At 9:10 a.m., people felt the first blast of heat radiating outward, a warning that lasted barely 2 minutes. Pigeons lifted from the warehouse roof. Dock workers looked up in confusion. The orange smoke grew dense, collapsing on itself like a curtain drawing shut. 2 minutes later, the Grand Camp detonated. The disaster unfolds. At 9:12 a.m., Texas City ceased to exist as it had been. A white light burst from the harbour. Instant, blinding, absolute. The Grand Camp did not simply explode, it disintegrated. A column of fire rose 2,000 feet into the air, its core so bright that witnesses miles away thought an atomic bomb had been dropped. The shockwave spread outward faster than sound, flattening nearly every building within a mile and shattering glass 40 miles from the coast. Those on the pier never knew what hit them. The volunteer firefighters, the crewmen, the curious onlookers, all vanished in a fraction of a second, reduced to shadows on concrete. Where a ship had floated moments earlier, there was now only a boiling crater of water and twisted iron. The Grand Camp's 2-ton anchor landed more than a mile inland, buried head deep in the clay. A piece of the propeller was found across the bay in Galveston. The first sound that followed the blast was silence, an impossible stillness in which the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the wind. It tore through the city like a physical thing carrying shards of glass and burning debris. Roofs peeled away, rail cars overturned. Men were thrown hundreds of feet through the air. A clerk in the Monsanto chemical plant remembered standing at his desk one moment and waking up outside, the building gone. Everything was red, he said later. Not fire, just red. In the business district, every storefront collapsed inward. Telephone poles fell like matchsticks. Automobiles were lifted and slammed against walls. The windows of the schoolhouse imploded, showering children with glass. Teachers herded them beneath desks, unaware that the danger was only beginning. Across the harbour, refinery storage tanks ruptured, igniting oceans of crude oil. The heat rolled over the city in waves so intense that paint blistered on houses half a mile away. The sky filled with smoke the colour of rust. Men staggered through the haze, ears bleeding, clothes on fire. They shouted names, but no one answered. A railroad switchman stumbled down the track, eyes burned shut, guiding himself by touch. Others, unhurt but deafened, wandered in circles, mouths moving soundlessly. The shockwave had knocked the air from their lungs. In Galveston, 20 miles across the bay, people felt the huge ground jump beneath them. Windows shattered up and down the strand. The blast registered as far away as Louisiana, where seismographs recorded it as an earthquake. Pilots flying overhead saw a mushroom cloud rising 15,000 feet. At the edge of the blast zone, survival became a matter of inches. A dock worker eating breakfast in a cafe 2 blocks from the port was thrown through the wall but lived. The man beside him was killed instantly by a splinter of glass no longer than a finger. A bus driver on 2nd Avenue saw the sky flash white, then woke up lying on the street, the bus upside down beside him. The firestorm fed itself. Burning oil ran down gutters like rivers. Explosions echoed as railcars and storage tanks ignited one after another. People fleeing the harbour found their way blocked by flame. Some jumped into ditches filled with water and crude lying there until the heat passed. At the port itself, nothing remained recognisable. The docks were gone. The Grand Camp had vaporised, leaving only fragments scattered across the bay. The neighbouring freighter High Flyer, carrying nearly 1,000 tons of sulphur and another 1,000 of ammonium nitrate, was aflame from stem to stern. Its mooring lines had burned away, and it drifted slowly like a wounded beast toward another ship, the Wilson B. Keene. Rescue was impossible in the first hour. The air itself seemed to burn. Thick black smoke turned day into twilight. Men tried to crawl through it, covering their faces with rags. Some never made it out. A refinery worker named Earl Johnson recalled seeing an entire storage tank rise from its foundation and lift into the air like a child's toy. He ran until he reached open ground, then looked back to see the skyline of Texas City engulfed in flame. It was like watching the end of the world, he said. At the fire station, which lay nearly half a mile from the docks, only the brick facade remained. Every piece of equipment, the engines, the hoses, the men, had vanished. Captain Paul Smith and his crew were never found intact. Their watches stopped at 9:12. For those still alive, instinct replaced reason. Mothers gathered children and ran toward the fields outside town. Doctors and nurses stumbled from the ruined hospital, dragging patients to safety. The smell of burning chemicals clung to the air, acrid and metallic. The city's switchboard had been destroyed, cutting all communication. For hours, no one beyond Texas City knew what had happened. Survivors lit fires and waved sheets from rooftops, hoping to signal passing planes. Finally, a crippled refinery worker reached a functioning radio in Lamarck and broadcast a single message. Texas City blown up, need help, everything gone. Within an hour, aid began to move. Fire brigades from Galveston, Houston, and Beaumont sped down the coastal highway. But as they approached, the scale of the disaster became clear. From miles away they could see the column of smoke thick as storm clouds and the glow of fire still spreading across the harbour. Hour 2. By noon, rescue crews reached the outskirts of the city. They found streets unrecognisable, landmarks erased. Telephone lines hung in tangles. Every pane of glass had vanished. Even concrete walls were pocked with shrapnel from the ship's hull. They worked blindly. The heat near the port was still unbearable. Hoses melted in their hands. Men wrapped wet rags around their faces, crawling through debris in search of voices. They found few. In one warehouse basement, 15 people had survived the blast by chance, trapped beneath collapsed beams. Rescuers pulled them out, blistered and coughing, and moved on. At the school, teachers led dazed children down shattered stairwells into the yard, where they sat in stunned silence, their faces grey with dust. Doctors set up triage under the water tower. The wounded lay on doors, tables, even car hoods. A nurse remembered that the hardest part was the quiet. They didn't cry, she said. Most just stared. By afternoon, the US Army had dispatched medics from Fort Crockett. Coast Guard cutters moved into the bay to fight fires from the water. But the high flyer still burned, drifting closer to the docks. Its cargo, ammonium nitrate and sulfur, was a ticking bomb no one could approach. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke inland. Visibility dropped to nothing. Firefighters advanced by sound, guided by the crackle of flame. Every few minutes another tank exploded, sending a concussion that rippled across the ground. It was impossible to tell where one explosion ended and another began. In Houston, reporters gathered at radio stations to relay the first news bulletins. A French freighter has exploded at Texas City. Hundreds feared dead families listening miles away didn't yet realize the scale of it. Many thought it must be an exaggeration. It wasn't. Hour 3, the night descends. As dusk fell, the fires still raged. The glow could be seen from Galveston Island, a red horizon that flickered through the haze. The entire waterfront was a single sheet of flame. Refinery workers from surviving plants formed bucket brigades, pumping water from ditches when the mains failed. Civilians joined them, passing pails hand to hand until their skin blistered. The heat warped railroad tracks. They curled upward like ribbons. The bodies of the dead were laid out in rows beside the road. There were too many to count. Some had no faces left to recognize, only tags with numbers. Others looked peaceful, as if asleep. In the middle of that chaos, small acts of grace endured. A minister knelt beside a man pinned under rubble and prayed until the flames forced him back. A teenage girl carried 2 infants away from the ruins of a house and waited with them until dawn. An engineer stayed at a pumping station all night to keep water flowing to the remaining hydrants, knowing it might explode at any moment. Late that night, the mayor of Texas City sent a message to Austin. We need everything. The governor ordered the National Guard to seal the area, fearing looting and further explosions. But most who entered did so to help, not to steal. Rescue crews came from every direction. Oil men from Port Arthur, students from Rice University, soldiers from Ellington Farm Field. They worked until their flashlights died. Then they worked by the light of the fires. Midnight, the second blast. Just before midnight, an uneasy calm settled over the harbour. The air was thick with smoke and fatigue. Men leaned on shovels, convinced the worst had passed. Then someone noticed the high flyer was no longer where it had been. The freighter had broken free of its moorings during the morning blast and had drifted toward the Wilson B. Keene, another cargo ship. Both were now burning. Firefighters debated whether to scuttle them. No one knew exactly what remained in the holds. They tried to tow the high flyer away from the docks, but the heat drove them back. At 1:10 a.m., April 17th, the second explosion struck. The high flyer detonated with almost the same fury as the ground camp. The blast hurled the Wilson B. Keene onto the shore, ripping it open. Flames shot 1,000 feet high. Windows shattered again throughout the city, undoing what little repair had begun. Dozens of rescuers, firemen, sailors, dock workers were killed instantly. For a moment the bay glowed white. Then darkness returned, thicker than before. The fires that followed burned for days. The morning after. When the sun rose on April 17th, the city resembled a war zone. Smoke still rose from the harbour. The air stank of sulphur, oil and death. Telephone poles leaned at odd angles. Twisted railcars lay half submerged in puddles of crude. The Red Cross established a command post near the courthouse. Doctors from Houston arrived in convoys, followed by morticians and military engineers. Soldiers used bulldozers to clear roads clogged with debris. Priests moved among the bodies, offering final blessings. Aerial photographs taken that day show a grey wasteland where homes and factories once stood. A pattern of ruin so complete that landmarks were unrecognisable. Entire blocks had vanished. The port itself was a crater, its edges ringed with the black skeletons of cranes. The official casualty count would eventually climb to nearly 600, though no one could be sure. Many bodies were never recovered, lost to the bay or consumed by fire. Thousands more were injured, burned, blinded or maimed. More than 5,000 people were left homeless, and yet, amid that devastation, life persisted. A woman gave birth in the refugee tent set up at the high school. A storekeeper reopened his shop 2 days later with the hand-painted sign, "We are still here." For weeks afterward, the fires continued to smoulder. At night, the horizon glowed faintly, as if the earth itself refused to cool. Rescue crews dug through the ruins with shovels and bare hands, searching for anything that could be recognized. A watch, a ring, a name. The men who had survived carried burns that never fully healed. The women carried silence. Children grew up measuring time by before and after. And through it all, the question hung in the smoke that lingered over the bay: how could a single ship turn an entire city to ash? The rescue and aftermath. When the sun rose over Texas City on April 17, 1947, the scale of ruin defied language. Smoke still coiled from the harbour in slow, exhausted spirals. The Gulf wind carried the sour tang of ammonium and oil. Entire neighbourhoods had been flattened. Streets ended in nothing. The water itself was black, thick with ash and splinters of ships that no longer existed. For the living, the first hours after dawn were a blur of disbelief. Men wandered barefoot through rubble that had once been their homes. Mothers clutched children who did not cry. The sound of the blast still rang in every ear, a low hum that refused to fade. No one waited for orders. They simply began. A dozen surviving refinery workers grabbed shovels and crowbars and started digging toward the docks. Others formed bucket lines to extinguish small fires that still licked at collapsed warehouses. The injured were everywhere, sitting against broken walls, lying in the streets, staggering aimlessly with burned clothes hanging from them, like paper. There were no sirens now, only the wind and the faint crackle of flame. By mid-morning, help was streaming in. Galveston dispatched its entire fire brigade. From Houston came ambulances, police and military trucks packed with medics. The coastal highway became a convoy of aid, doctors, nurses, priests and volunteers who had only heard that a city had vanished. When they arrived, they stopped in silence, staring at what looked like the aftermath of a bombing campaign. The main road to the port was blocked by a tangle of railcars and twisted pipe. Army engineers cut paths through the wreckage with bulldozers borrowed from construction crews. They moved slowly, for every tank and drum might still explode. The air shimmered with heat. The asphalt was soft beneath their boots. Inside the city limits, survivors had set up a makeshift triage at the high school gymnasium. Desks became operating tables. Chalkboards were covered in lists of the missing. Doctors worked under lanterns hung from the rafters, their hands blistered from disinfectant. Supplies ran out by noon. Volunteers tore sheets into bandages, while townspeople donated what medicine they had in their cupboards: iodine, aspirin, whiskey. A nurse from Houston remembered that the smell of burned flesh was everywhere. She said later, "You could tell the newcomers because they went pale within minutes. The rest of us just worked." The dead were brought to the refrigerated warehouse near the rail yard, the only structure large enough to hold them. By nightfall it overflowed. Soldiers lined bodies in neat rows outside, covering them with tarps and numbering them with chalk. Identification was nearly impossible. Many faces were gone, many names lost. Rings, watches, and bits of clothing became the only clues. Clerks recorded every item, every scrap of evidence, hoping that somewhere a family would recognize what remained. As darkness settled, the fire still burned. The refinery tanks glowed from within, lighting the sky a dull red. The high flyer had already exploded, but smaller tanks continued to detonate through the night, dull, rhythmic thumps that rolled across the bay like distant thunder. Rescuers learned to pause after each blast, waiting to see if the ground would move again. The long night. For the next 48 hours, the city became a field hospital. Every church, school and warehouse housed the wounded. Lines of stretchers filled the sidewalks. The Red Cross established a command centre beside the courthouse, its flag hanging limp in the heat. Communication was still sporadic. The switchboard had been destroyed, so messages travelled by word of mouth or handwritten notes carried by drivers. Radio operators rigged temporary antennas on the roofs that remained, sending desperate calls for plasma and bandages. One operator's message went nationwide. Texas City needs everything: doctors, nurses, food, tents, blood. Help poured in. From San Antonio came army surgeons. From Louisiana, rail cars loaded with medical supplies. The Coast Guard dispatched ships to search the bay for survivors. They found mostly debris: barrels, splintered timbers, the occasional human form drifting among the wreckage. On shore, soldiers combed the blast zone methodically, marking the ground with stakes whenever they found a body. The heat made the air shimmer, and the smell of oil clung to their uniforms. They worked until exhaustion forced them to stop, then lay down where they stood and slept on the pavement. Reporters arrived by the dozens, their cameras hanging heavy around their necks. The photographs they took would soon appear on front pages across the country, the jagged skyline, the crater where the docks had been, the lone flag still flying from the courthouse roof. America had seen destruction overseas, but never like this at home. For the survivors, time fractured. Morning and night no longer mattered. Everything was measured by the arrival of trucks and the rumble of explosions in the distance. Some people wandered the ruins calling names for hours, unwilling to stop even when their voices broke. A woman was found kneeling beside a heap of twisted metal, whispering her husband's name over and over, though there was nothing human left beneath it. Children who had lost their parents clung to soldiers' legs. The National Guard turned the city park into an orphan shelter, its bandstand draped with sheets for shade. Volunteers brought milk and biscuits, trying not to let the little ones see the fires beyond the trees. The search for the missing. In the days that followed, the search took on a grim rhythm. Bulldozers cleared paths, then rescue crews moved in with shovels and stretchers. The work was dangerous, pockets of gas still ignited without warning. Men carried canaries in cages to test the air, just as miners did underground. When the birds fell silent, the rescuers backed out and waited for the wind to shift. The morgue expanded into a nearby hangar. Identification teams from the FBI and military examined each body, cataloguing jewellery and dental records. Churches opened their doors for vigils that lasted through the night. On the third day, a mass burial took place at the city cemetery. 63 coffins, all marked unknown, were lowered into a common grave. A priest read a prayer in English, a pastor followed in Spanish, and finally a French officer bowed his head for his lost countrymen. The crowd joined hands. The wind off the bay carried the smell of salt and smoke. Meanwhile, the living faced the slow work of survival. More than 5,000 were homeless. The National Guard erected tent cities on the outskirts of town, orderly rows of khaki canvas where families slept on army cots. Field kitchens served soup and coffee from dawn until dusk. In the evenings, people sat outside their tents and watched the horizon still glowing faintly from the smouldering refineries. Some prayed aloud, most just stared. The Red Cross distributed clothing and ration books. The government promised loans to rebuild. But for many, the loss was beyond calculation. Wages stopped, banks were closed, and the docks, the town's lifeblood, were gone. Fathers who had supported households with the strength of their backs found themselves idle overnight. Still, the instinct to rebuild stirred even among the ruins. Within a week, volunteers had cleared the main road. Stores that still had walls reopened with cardboard signs reading, "Business as usual." A barber hung a hand-painted notice on a scorched door. "Haircuts 25 cents. If you still have hair." Humour became defiance. The investigation. When the fires finally died, federal investigators arrived, chemists, engineers, and Coast Guard officers tasked with answering the question on everyone's lips. How could this have happened? They examined the crater where the Grand Camp had been. It measured nearly 30 feet deep and 100 feet across. Fragments of hull plating lay embedded in nearby buildings. The blast's energy, they calculated, was equivalent to 2,000 tons of TNT, the same as a small nuclear weapon. Witnesses recounted the events of that morning. The smoke, the orange colour, the decision to seal the hatches and pump in steam. Experts shook their heads. Ammonium nitrate, they explained, was stable under normal conditions but violently unstable when heated and confined. Steam had only accelerated the reaction. The report that followed was meticulous, its language clinical but damning. It described a chain of ordinary mistakes compounded by ignorance and haste. No villain, no saboteur, only procedure, routine, and faith in the wrong kind of experience. For the people of Texas City, those pages were both explanation and indictment. They had trusted the system that promised safety. They learned instead that progress, without caution, could be lethal. Lawsuits began almost immediately. Families filed claims against the federal government, arguing that the fertilizer had been manufactured in government plants and shipped without warning labels. It became the first major test of the Federal Tort Claims Act, allowing citizens to sue the United States for negligence. Years later, after endless hearings, the courts would acknowledge partial responsibility, but no amount of compensation could replace what had been lost. The long recovery. Summer came, and with it the unbearable heat of the Gulf. The wreckage baked in the sun, releasing the smell of charred wood and chemical ash. Yet little by little, the city began to rise again. The refineries rebuilt first, essential to the economy, backed by national urgency. Steel frameworks went up where nothing had stood. New safety standards were written into every contract. Vents for cargo holds, temperature monitors, emergency drills. What had once been assumed would never again be assumed. Homes followed. Carpenters from across Texas volunteered their labour. Churches organised crews that worked 7 days a week, hammering, painting, sweeping away glass. The local paper printed daily lists of those found alive, of those still missing, and of every new building permit issued. Each number was a small victory. By the anniversary of the explosion, the harbour was operating again. Ships once more lined the pier, their hulls freshly painted, their manifests inspected by men who had learned what those papers meant. A bronze plaque was placed near the water's edge, bearing the names of the firefighters who had perished. Visitors still stop there today. The metal is worn smooth where fingers have traced the same letters for decades. Yet recovery was not simply rebuilding walls, it was learning to live with memory. Survivors spoke of strange habits that lingered, flinching at sudden noises, checking the colour of smoke rising from refineries, dreaming of fire. Many moved away, unable to face the harbour. Others stayed, believing that to leave would be to let the dead vanish twice. Each spring, on April 16th, the sirens wail through Texas City hours at exactly 9:12 a.m. One long, mournful note that rolls across the refineries and the neighbourhoods beyond. For a minute, everything stops. Cars pull over, workers remove their helmets, children fall silent in classrooms. When the sound fades, life resumes, as it always does, but the echo remains. Echoes beyond Texas City. The lessons of that day spread far beyond the Gulf Coast. Industries across America rewrote their manuals. Ships carrying hazardous materials were required to post warnings, to ventilate cargo holds, to train crews in chemical behaviour. Fire departments established the first standardised procedures for dealing with chemical explosions. The term hazmat entered the national vocabulary. Engineers who studied the blast later said that it marked the true beginning of modern industrial safety. Regulations born from tragedy saved untold lives in the decades that followed. Yet for those who lived through it, such knowledge was small comfort. They had paid the tuition for that learning in blood. In the years afterward, Texas City earned a reputation for resilience. Refineries continued to expand, the port regained its traffic, and new neighbourhoods rose from the ashes. But no one forgot. Every generation heard the story from the one before, the ship, the fire, the morning the sky turned white. Grandfathers told it on porches pointing toward the harbour. Teachers told it in classrooms. It became not just history, but identity. One survivor, interviewed decades later, summed it up simply: "We built this town twice. The second time we understood what it cost." The legacy and reflection. In the months that followed, Texas City began to breathe again. Not deeply, not easily, but enough. The smoke thinned. The sounds of hammers replaced the echo of sirens, and out of the wreckage rose a town that refused to disappear. The disaster had left a wound too vast for any single family to carry, so the community bore it together. Churches became town halls, then relief centres, then sanctuaries once more. Neighbours who had lost everything shared what little remained. A loaf of bread, a spare cot, a listening ear. Beneath the weight of tragedy, the city discovered its own endurance. Yet even as it rebuilt, questions lingered. How could such a thing happen? How had a ship filled with fertilizer, a symbol of life, become an instrument of death? The investigations that followed stretched across oceans, through laboratories and courtrooms, searching for answers in chemistry, paperwork, and human error. Engineers sifted through twisted steel, analysing every fragment that could be found. They measured the crater where the Grand Camp had stood, 30 feet deep, 100 feet wide, and compared it to wartime bomb sites in Europe. The energy released, they concluded, matched the force of a small atomic blast. But the weapon here had not been built in secret laboratories. It had been built by ignorance, by complacency, by routine. The official reports named no villains, the captain had followed his training, the dock workers had done what they always did, the regulators had trusted the science of the day. Each decision had seemed small, sensible, even right, until the sum of them levelled a city. Out of that realization came reform. The Coast Guard rewrote its manuals. Every shipment of ammonium nitrate would henceforth carry clear markings and require constant ventilation. Federal inspectors gained authority to halt unsafe loadings. Fire departments across the nation introduced chemical fire drills and protective gear that would later become standard issue. Industrial safety, once an afterthought, became a profession. But progress could not erase grief. For the families of Texas City, the future arrived carrying the weight of memory. In living rooms rebuilt from ashes, widows kept framed photographs on mantels, faces of men who'd gone to work one ordinary morning and never returned. Children grew up tracing those photographs with small fingers, learning their fathers' names through stories told in low voices after supper. Every spring, when the magnolias bloomed and the Gulf wind turned warm again, the memories returned. The people remembered the way the smoke looked against the blue sky, the sound that followed, the silence after. They remembered who they had been before that moment, and who they had become after it. A city reborn. By 1948, reconstruction was visible everywhere. New refineries rose beside the ruins of the old. Streets were repaved, schools reopened. The harbour filled once more with ships, tankers, freighters, barges, each arrival both a comfort and a test of courage. The economy revived faster than anyone had dared hope, fueled by the same spirit that had drawn men to Texas City in the first place. The belief that work could conquer anything. Still, the scars were permanent. Some were etched in the landscape, cratered ground, scorched pilings, a twisted rail line that city officials chose to leave as a memorial. Others lived unseen, in the minds of those who had heard that first explosion. Many could never stand close to the docks again. Some left town entirely, carrying the noise with them wherever they went. The city honoured its dead with dignity. A marble monument rose in the cemetery, engraved with the names of the known and the word unknown repeated again and again for those who had vanished without trace. Every year on April 16th a ceremony was held at the site. Firefighters in pressed uniforms stood beside refinery workers in their coveralls. A single bell tolled 38 times, once for each volunteer firefighter lost. Then the sirens wailed, a single long note at exactly 9:12 a.m. For 60 seconds the refineries went silent. Even the air seemed to pause. That ritual endures. Generations later, school children still gather in the same spot. Teachers tell them what happened here. The ship, the smoke, the flash that turned day to night. They learn not just the facts, but the meaning, the cost of assuming that progress is harmless, the duty to question, to measure, to respect the unseen power of the materials that build the modern world. The broader echo. The Texas City disaster became a turning point in American industry. It prompted Congress to strengthen the Coast Guard's authority over hazardous shipments. The Bureau of Mines expanded its research into explosive materials. Insurance companies, once silent partners, began demanding safety audits before issuing policies. Out of devastation came the framework of modern risk management. Chemical plants across the country installed ventilation systems and temperature sensors. Fire departments in port cities formed hazardous materials units. Engineers began teaching the event as a case study in every major university. The phrase Texas City became shorthand for the price of negligence, a warning printed in textbooks, recited in training halls, whispered across loading docks whenever someone took a shortcut. Yet history, as it often does, softened with time. The city thrived again. New generations arrived who knew the story only as legend. But beneath the bustle of commerce and the rhythm of refinery work, the memory persisted like an ember. Every worker who glanced toward the bay at dawn, every ship captain who saw the siren towers along the wharf felt it. The knowledge that safety is not inherited, it must be earned anew each day. The personal aftermath. For survivors, life divided into two eras, before and after the blast. Many never spoke of what they had seen. Others spoke often, as if repetition might lighten the burden. They told of the eerie silence that followed the explosion, of finding neighbours they could not recognise, of nights when the smell of smoke returned in dreams. A refinery worker named Earl Johnson, who had helped pull bodies from the ruins, said years later, "We didn't rebuild because we were brave. We rebuilt because we didn't know what else to do." That sentiment captured the soul of the town. There was no glory in survival, only duty. To the dead, to the living, to the idea that a community could rise again no matter how completely it had been erased. Some survivors found meaning in service. The volunteer fire department was rebuilt within a year, staffed partly by widows' sons barely old enough to shave. They trained with new equipment, new rules, new respect for the unseen dangers they might face. On the walls of the new station hung a plaque bearing the motto, "Never again unprepared." The churches filled each Sunday, pews lined with families who had once shared grief at mass funerals. Hymns that spoke of deliverance carried new weight in their voices. They sang not in despair, but in defiance. What endures still today? Today, Texas City stands much as it did before. Refineries humming, cargo ships anchored in the bay, the scent of salt and diesel mingling in the air. Visitors driving along the seawall might never guess what happened here. Only the memorials tell the story. The anchor of the Grand Camp mounted in a quiet park, the bronze plaque at the firefighters' monument, the simple gravestones that mark the resting place of the unknown. The city has suffered other industrial accidents since, none as catastrophic, but each a reminder that the line between progress and peril is thin. Yet each time the response has been swifter, the damage contained, the lessons remembered. The systems born from 1947 continue to protect lives across the world. Every safety valve, every hazard label, every emergency drill owes something to the people who died here. If there is a measure of redemption, it lies in that legacy. Out of fire came understanding, out of loss came vigilance, out of ceremonies came the will to speak, to tell and retell, so that forgetting never becomes another form of danger. Reflecting on the past. As the years turned to decades, survivors grew old. Children who had been carried from the rubble became grandparents. The sound of the blast faded from memory, but its lesson endured in the rhythm of everyday life. Each spring, the ceremony at the port draws fewer original witnesses, yet the crowd never shrinks. Refinery workers stand shoulder to shoulder with schoolchildren, their faces lit by the morning sun. When the siren sounds, they bow their heads, and for 1 minute the city stands still. Ships at anchor, traffic stopped, conversations halted. Then the note fades, leaving behind a stillness that feels almost sacred. What happened in Texas City was not merely a local tragedy. It was the moment when America confronted the hidden cost of its own ambition. The realization that the same ingenuity that could feed nations could also destroy them if left unchecked. It was a reckoning written not in politics or theory, but in fire and human loss. The harbour rebuilt, the world moved on, but the echo of that morning remains. A reminder that progress is never free, that safety is a covenant renewed by every generation that labours in its shadow. And so, when the siren's final note drifts out over the bay, mingling with the cry of gulls and the hum of machinery, the people of Texas City remember, not with fear, but with reverence. They remember the workers, the sailors, the firefighters, the mothers and children who bore the price of the modern world. They remember that every whistle that blows at shift change, every ship that leaves port, carries with it a promise made in smoke and steel. Never again through ignorance, never again through complacency.
Yep.
When the whistle fell silent, America learned what it cost to build itself.